Hello and welcome to today's video. It is on changes in ecosystems, part 2. The purpose of today's lesson is to look at the fossil record to be able to make observations about the past, as well as look at human impact on biodiversity. This is from 6.3 and 6.4 of your textbook. So first up, 6.3, ecosystem changes in the past. So we know that the Earth has been subjected to mass changes over time. That's periods of glaciation, so ice ages, as well as warming, meteorite damage, volcanic activity, mass extinctions, and more recently, human impact. And scientists have been developing ways to examine both biotic and abiotic changes throughout the past. Scientists can measure carbon dioxide levels in snow because as the snow falls, it traps the air within it and over time creates these various layers with different levels of CO2 in them. So scientists can drill into polar ice caps to determine the age of each layer as well as the duration of the cold period. The higher the global temperature at the time, well then the more CO2 is in the ice. A similar technique scientists use when analyzing sediment on the ocean floor by measuring the ratio of an oxygen isotope. So we have oxygen 18 and oxygen 16, and scientists look at the ratio between those two as oxygen 16 evaporates more easily during cold periods. Another way of measuring ecological change in the past is by using the fossil record. So fossils are most commonly found in areas where remains are protected from decay and predatory consumption. And this can be boggy marshes or floodplains and estuaries. And this image here you would probably recognize from one of your previous questions. So fossils can show degradation of forests due to cataclysmic events such as climate change, meteor showers, and volcanic activity, but they can also just give ideas of what was going on in general at the time. They can also indicate mass movements of tectonic plates. So we will come back to this image when we get to the question section. In the meantime, I'll point out we have various different stratum layers, and this kind of texture just represents different abiotic conditions at the time. Then we have biotic preservations, so fossils of what was therefore living in that period of time, and those abiotic fossils vary depending on the biotic fossils vary depending on the abiotic conditions. So 6.4, human impact on biodiversity. There's a few key terms down the side here which you can go more into in your textbook, but I will speak more generally in this video. So, biodiversity. It was first coined by this man, E.O. Wilson. He's known as the father of biodiversity, and he was a massive advocate for biodiversity. And biodiversity is the variety of life on our planet. We need our planet for our resources. That's the food, the water, the energy we require. Even when we get unwell, its resources can be used for medicine. So, biodiversity, our planet, it stabilizes our climate. The oceans act as a buffer for temperature change. Our planet also breaks down material, and we need it for food, so pollination. Biodiversity is simply the variety of life on our planet. And there can be variation in 3 ways. Variation in genetics, variation in species, and variation in ecosystems. E.O. Wilson in about the 1980s, when he was asked about the effects of human impact on biodiversity, he came up with this mnemonic, HIPPO, to help us remember the main effects. And the H here stands for habitat destruction. So I'll pull up this image from the textbook at the same time. And habitat destruction, well, that can be the clearing of our rainforest for logging. It can also be what we do for mining and building up cities. It's just the clearing of land. It can also be the rerouting of rivers and riverbeds when we build up dams. It has massive impacts on the ecosystems and species downstream. The I stands for invasive species. So this just means when we bring a species from somewhere else into a new area. And this often creates what we call pests. And that's an organism that causes direct or indirect harm to humans or their resources. It's an organism in the wrong place because environments take time to adapt to new changes, but often these new species can have very rapid impacts on the ecosystem. Then the P stands for pollution. So this can be pollution with the air, with gases, with pesticides, as well as pollution in the water and pollution of the land, so landfill. The other P stands for population. So with humans, we are seeing this massive exponential boom in population growth. So overpopulation of humans means more demands on planet Earth and its resources. The O can also stand for over-exploitation. So with more people, it means more need, more demand, and we see this by over-harvesting our fish supplies, but also over-harvesting our plants, our crops. So that was in about the 1980s. Since then, we can add certainly climate change to the list, and that's increase in greenhouse gases based on our more demanding lifestyles. So he said it's bad to decrease biodiversity, not only because once it's gone, but it also has a massive impact financially on our community and our government. We rely on biodiversity through speciation, and if you think back, that's when one species becomes two, and it takes time, generations. Once we understand biodiversity, once we understand the impacts that we are having, well then we can make changes to reverse those impacts or at least minimize them. So this second image here shows us what is called biological magnification, and it's the concentration of substances within the tissues of organisms as they pass along up the food chain. So an example of this is the Minamata disease. It was first discovered in Minamata City, which is in Kunamoto in Japan in 1956. And it was this disease caused by the release of mercury in the industrial wastewater from a nearby factory, through industrial wastewater in a nearby factory. The highly toxic chemical bioaccumulated in the plankton and in the shellfish that ate the plankton and in the fish in the Minamata Bay, which was then eaten by the local people. And this caused decades and decades of diseases. It wasn't handled very well by the government, and many people became sick because of it, not to mention all the species. And it's just this idea of, well, it's not so bad in small concentrations, but as those higher order species eat the species with higher concentrations in them, it just accumulates in their tissues. So by the time that people were eating the fish, they were getting pretty large doses of mercury over time, and that's not a good thing. So with that in mind, let's talk about some questions. These are questions just relevant to the last couple of weeks. So chapter 6, we spoke about in our last video ecological succession, and we said that succession is change in an environment over time. This question here is taken from QCAA, and it shows us succession in a hypothetical ecosystem. So over time, we can see change. Identify which type of succession, we know the two, primary and secondary, has occurred, and give 3 reasons to support your response. So you can pause the video here and answer that one. So by now you should have had some time, and if we were to go through the exemplar response together, I hope that you guys said, what is secondary succession? Because we're not starting with bare rock here. The process of succession was started by harvesting. So here everything was chopped down, which occurred at this level, that's called a seri, and the soil was not destroyed, so that's why it's secondary. Secondary means there's still soil. Secondary means there's something there before it. This is a main difference between both of them, and in 3 to 5, we can see that the pioneer species, so that's like the mosses, the lichens, the ferns, the grasses, were replaced by climax species. We could call this a primary forest and a secondary forest as well. There's some other alternatives you may have said to still get marks for that question. So back to this diagram. Let's have a couple of questions on it now. The last time I showed you this, it has been slightly updated because there was critique on it by QCAA. So fossilized marine organisms are found in this site across 7 stratum layers. We can see that there's a variety of fossils and a variety of layers. Those fossils change over time based on the abiotic conditions that resulted. So analyze the data above to identify 3 relationships that provide evidence of changes in past ecosystems. So that is the key of the question. Identify at least 1 biotic and 1 abiotic change. So question A, I skipped to B, it was about calculating the diversity, which we've done previously. So identify 1 limitation of using fossil evidence. Let's jump into some answers then. So evidence of a biotic change is that the species diversity decreases. So biotic, we're referring to what was once the living things. Remember, biotic is something living or that ever was once living. So we can see that in stratum 3, 4, 5, diversity decreases. There were more different types in the earlier layers. As well as this, the evidence in each stratum is different. This could indicate abiotic changes over time, therefore influencing species diversity. There's some alternative responses that you may have included, and if I just move me down here. So acceptable evidence of biotic changes, maybe you said after stratum 6 there were changes, or maybe you said in stratum 1 that was the highest diversity count of organisms, and you may have included some other thoughts there. So question C, a limitation of fossils is that not all biota are preserved in fossils. In fact, it requires some pretty specific conditions for fossils to be preserved. So if we looked at another question now, here we go. First thing we will do is I'll just talk through it with you, and then you can pause the video, answer it, and we'll look at the answers together. So this graph below shows seasonal patterns, so it's within a year, 2012, of soil temperature, amount of littlefoil, and soil respiration. So how much oxygen is released, carbon dioxide is taken in plants within the soil. In both a primary forest and a secondary forest. So that means early stage forests, later stage forests closer to climax community. If we looked at soil temperature, we have temperature on this scale, then we have month time below. We can see that during the months, so during June and July, the soil temperature increased and then decreased, and it was lowest around January, December, beginning and start of the year. The little fall was fairly consistent with some points, some low points here, but with a big peak in, October for both primary and secondary forests. By the way, that was for both primary and secondary forests too. Whereas for soil respiration, we can see there's a bit of a separation now between the two. The secondary forest, represented by these solid circles, is still in a similar pattern to the primary, but just lower. So compare the ecosystems across the temporal scale using the given data. We just talked through that then pretty well. 4 marks, come up with 4 points. Then identify an effect of increasing the availability of nutrients on the carrying capacity of this primary forest. Give a reason to support your answer. Okay, so I just paused the video, had a visitor. So coming back into this where I think we were last at. So we've just talked about the question, and now you've had time to pause the video, or if not, pause it now and answer it in your own words. And hopefully you have a response by now. So let's go through the exemplar responses together. A couple of just some definitions, we could say. When there is an event of succession, that's life coming back to where there was no life. So primary is when there's no soil, secondary is when there is soil. But our primary forest is kind of like that forest before there is the climax community. So that's what we're talking about with a primary and secondary forest. Characteristics of a primary forest include there is more grasses and low-level shrubs that are living and photosynthesizing closer to the soil, as opposed to the higher level trees, which block out the sun and therefore outcompete these lower level intermediate species that you would find in a primary forest. So, first question, in both forests, soil respiration is lowest in January, yes, and highest in July, yes, and then low again in December and in October. However, the range of soil respiration in the secondary forest, so that's represented by the circles, is lower compared to the primary forest. Why could this be? Go back to this picture here. Well, in a primary forest, there is more biomass, there is more matter living around the soil and in the soil compared to a secondary forest. So you would expect a higher level of soil respiration, therefore, in a primary forest. There's some variations here which you can read, but let's jump on to B. So the question was, identify an effect of increasing the availability of nutrients on carrying capacity of the primary forest ecosystem. So carrying capacity would increase, leading to increased levels of litterfall. This is because nutrients for primary producers are a density-independent factor. So when we say density-independent factors, it means that, yes, the amount of biomass, how many species we would see, would increase as nutrients increase, because they're not competing so much like they are of a mammal species competing over a predator species competing over a prey source. There is plenty of carbon dioxide in the air, plenty of sunlight for these low-level primary producers. Let's jump on to another question. The information below shows the relative magnitudes of changes to global tropical rainforests caused by changes in drivers. We have habitat change, climate, invasive species, over-exploitation, as well as pollution. And we have two keys here. We've got low, moderate, high, very high. So very high effects, high effect, and then a low effect for these three. Then we see these arrows, and we have an increasing impact, and straight up is a very rapid increase of the impact. So predict the two drivers, so out of these 5, which has the greatest magnitude of change on an ecosystem and their direct impacts for future biodiversity in global tropical rainforests. So with that in mind, you can pause the video here, come up with some of your own thoughts before we answer them. So hopefully you've had time to have a look, and the answers we came up with in the exemplar is this one and this one. Why overexploitation? Because if you think back to the key, it is high. And habitat change, well, that one is very high. Why is overexploitation? Endangered species due to harvesting species from the wild at rates faster than natural populations can recover. So it's just providing a bit of context to the answer here. One more question. So, multiple choice. The figure shows the relationship between spatial, so that means over space, and temporal, over time, drivers affecting ecosystem change. So it does not say what they are so much, but the size of the circles represent the proportion of drivers. So here's a very large one, here's a very small one. At a certain spatial, so whereabouts, global, national, or local, and temporal, fast, medium, slow, very slow. So agricultural intensification along a river has led to substantial increases in fertilizer application and increases in stock numbers. From the given data, predict the speed of ecosystem change along the river. Is it fast, medium, slow, or very slow? Pause the video, come up with your response now. Okay, hope you have come up with a response. And the key to this question is change along the river, this particular environment. So we're talking about a local scale here, and it's saying, all right, well, if this is the spatial scale, then what is going to be the effect at which it has a response? So we know that our answer falls within this local region. But then how do we know, is it going to be fast, medium, slow? Well, you can see 55% is the largest driver in this temporal scale. So it's going to fall in this region of being a very fast change. That is all for this video. So from here on, guys, jump into the textbook, 6.3 to 6.4, read and answer. 6.4s are pretty meaty, so allow some time for that or a few nights. And then chapter 6 review questions, which you will have time for in class this week. Guys, I'm looking forward to seeing you in person. God bless. I'll see you soon.